So I'm Rob May. I'm a general partner here at PJC. After building two companies, one which had a good exit and one which is still running, I decided to come to the investing side for a while, and because it's a little bit easier, and didn't want to do the hard work that you guys are doing. So a lot of respect and admiration for those of you that are going to build. I'm going to talk a little bit about scaling AI and some things that you might want to think about when you're post product market fit that I have seen across some of my investments, and just some of my friends' companies that that might help you if you're building a company that's related to AI. And I'm gonna start with some of the things that are a little quicker, and then we'll go to some of the things that are more in depth. So AI is a little bit different than other technologies for a couple of reasons. And so the points that I'm going to hit on are related to that. And we're going to talk about 5 things to consider as you scale. One, does the AI even matter in your product? Number 2, tacking on to Sassy metrics that investors are more used to seeing. Number 3, this concept of AI theater. Number 4, something that I call the Pac Framework, which is a way to think about AI and a way to encourage your potential customers to think about AI. And then finally, we'll look at value chains and AI competitive advantage. So just a couple of quick slides on looking at traditional business theory, competitive advantage, Porter's 5 forces, value chains, et cetera, and how AI might impact those. So I want to start by, I'll tell you a little bit about a experiment that we ran at my second company. And so what we built chatbots for customer support. And in the early days of the company in 2016 and 2017, we focused a lot on AI. And the reason we focused on it was because that's what everybody was looking for. And after about a year of just beating our heads against the wall and realizing that we had these endless conversations where, we would talk to customers and we would say, okay, great. Well, tell us what you're looking for. They're like, we're looking for some AI. And we're like, great, for what? Well, we don't know. What does your AI do? These were just people whose boss had said, we need to be in the AI world, go out and talk to a bunch of companies and waste their time and have them educate you on the market. And so it was a big pain in the ass. And so we decided to start saying like, okay, we're not going to take these people. We've got to acquire people via more traditional measures. Normally when you start a company, use your network and your friends to sort of find the initial buyers. They read about you in the press. You don't start a lot of traditional advertising right out of the gate. And we said, let's start some traditional advertising and see what we can do. And we found something very interesting, which was we got a lot better leads when we didn't mention AI in our product. We just mentioned what it did. And so one of the things that I have taken from that is when people say they are looking for AI, unless they can really clearly articulate why they need an AI solution, you probably want to stay away from those leads as you scale. Whether or not you position with AI, I think depends on what you're doing, right? If AI is just a differentiator, I don't know that you need to lead with that, right? I think you need to say, hey, we solved this problem, your marketing automation tool, and we provide better open rates, and we do that by a bunch of AI prediction stuff. But I think you talk about the AI piece later. I think you don't lead with it in any of your marketing. Obviously, you should always experiment with these things because every market's different. But one of the things I've seen time and time again is AI companies we're excited about it. We love the technology we work on. And so we pound our chests and like, AI, check it out. And a lot of the buyers don't get it or don't understand it or are afraid of it or whatever. The exception to that might be if you're selling something that is newer that you could only do because AI exists, right? So if I was building a robot that could give you a haircut, you might be like, well, why has nobody built this before? Well, AI makes it possible. I might harp a little bit more on the AI in the initial marketing than I would otherwise. So one of the things that you have to figure out before you can scale for your buyer is how much does the AI matter and how much do you talk about it? Because too often the early customers that come in will be different than the customers you start to see as you scale. And just as a side note, I'll tell you a story from my first business about that. That's not AI related, but highlights the point. So my first business was a company that did backup for cloud computing applications like Google Apps and Salesforce and Office 365. And when we started and we had about 300 customers, we surveyed those customers and we said, what is the thing you most want us to build? And they said, we want to be able to store our data. You know, we went into Google Apps and we pulled out the data and we put it somewhere else. And like, we want to be able to store it in our own S3 bucket. Some of you might not even know what an S3 bucket is, right? But it's the idea that you would go and get your own long string of letters and numbers and have a key that you could access your own Amazon storage. No sane human being consumer is ever going to do that or apply for that. And so my team got all excited and they're like, this is the thing we're going to build. And we built it and like 5 people bought it, right? And then so 5 people used it when we had 300 customers and like 7 people used it when we had like 10,000 customers. And so, you know, early adopters are sometimes different, and it's one of the things that you have to keep in mind. So number 2, Sassy metrics. Now, if you did a SaaS company in sort of the 2006 through 2012 phase, when sort of VCs first started funding them and getting familiar with SaaS metrics, to, you know, when finally by 2012, pretty much every VC had done SaaS. But a lot of times people didn't talk about it the right way, because when people sold packaged software, we looked at bookings, we looked at downloads, we looked at things like this that, I mean, you can still measure bookings for a SaaS company, but it's not as useful of a tool as MRR or customer churn or anything like that. You don't have churn with packaged software a lot of times, because you're selling it to somebody and they're going to go off and use it for a few years. And maybe in a few years you call them when you have a new version, but you know, you didn't worry about churn. And so a lot of entrepreneurs struggled. Constant Contact was a very big company, got acquired for $1 billion, was, you know, built here in Boston, one of the first email marketing companies. And one of the advisors to my company was the head of marketing there. And he used to talk about how difficult it was for them to get investment, because investors didn't understand the metrics that they used to run the business. They didn't understand MRR or churn. And they didn't have even when you explained it, they didn't have an intuitive feel for it yet, like you normally get when you run a business, about the metrics. And so one of the things you have to do is you have to figure out, how can you make your AI metrics a little more sassy, right? How can you tie them back as close as possible to either make them look like SaaS metrics, or you know, you can have a few that sort of deviate, but you need to show how maybe they're inputs to key SaaS metrics, right? So think about what you measure, and I've got this chart on the right, and one of the ways to think about, to explain it to people, might be, I'm an investor in a company called BotKeeper, and BotKeeper does automated accounting and bookkeeping workflows. And they split their workflows into 4 pieces, right? And so they have workflows that you can just script with code. They're not hard to do. They don't require any machine learning. It's more RPA-like, if you know the RPA industry. Then they have workflows where there's some variability, so they need a machine learning model to help. And so those are scripted, but they're scripted with machine learning. Then they have workflows where the machine learning and the humans help each other. And so sometimes the machine learning might go through and say, read a bunch of receipts and classify them, and the human just goes through and goes, accurate, not accurate, not accurate, you know, and just labels it and tags it to train the machine. And then you still have accounting workflows that have to be purely human. And one of the things that they measure is how they move between these buckets, right? How do they take more things that the humans can do and move them into the ML plus humans bucket so that they're cheaper and more efficient? How do they take the things from the ML plus humans bucket and make them ML scripted, right? So they measure these things and they look at these things internally. So what you could do in that scenario is you can try to figure out, how do you teach investors about that metric and why it's important to your business if you're BotKeeper? And then how do you tie those two, because this impacts MRR in this way, because this impacts churn, right? We've learned that the things that humans do tend to be, you know, when you ask people why they churn, 85% of the people, when they give us a reason, it's one of the human workflows. We got to get the humans out of the workflow. So we're trying to, you know, move them down the stack. So it's just one of the big things that you have to think about is, you, as people thinking about AI, have all these new ideas and new metrics and things you look at that are important to your business. Investors don't understand those yet. And so you have to tell a story that ties as best you can to what they know. You can do a little bit of re-education, but you can't do a ton. AI theater. So this idea actually came from my first company, Backupify, which was, if you had, you know, a terabyte of data in your business Gmail and you wanted us to back it up, what would happen is you would sign up and you would go and you would click start the backup. You would authenticate to your Google account, and then you'd send us an email and go, I did it and nothing's happening. And you didn't understand that like it took a while to go in. It typically took a couple of days to do the initial first backup, right? Because we had API limits that we had to respect and everything else. So we started doing this stupid thing where like when you would click that, we would just put this little spinning wheel up at the top and start showing some of the file names we're doing backup. And it was like magic to people. And so we call it software theater because we were like, wow, people just thought it was so great. And you're like, it doesn't matter in the functionality at all. It didn't make the product better in any functional way, but it gave people a sense of like, wow, the thing's working and it's doing that. So this happens a lot with AI, which is if your AI is really, really good, part of what makes great AI is it's kind of invisible to the user, right? It's very smart and it does these things and makes these recommendations or predictions, and you don't even have to think about it. And then what happens, and we saw this at Talos, people come in and they're like, where's the AI? And we're like, well, it's so good, you don't even need to, you think about it, or that's just a sign it's working so well. And we had so many of these conversations, we came up with this idea of like, we need some AI theater. We need some stupid thing that's meaningless, but it's not meaningless because it provides psychological value to the customer. It's functionally meaningless, but it shows an AI trick. And so we would do things like, we would ingest your support documentation, and we would pull out one of the sentences and we would say, this is a sentence from this article, and they say yes, and we would generate right in front of them 3 paraphrases of it, right, that the bot could use, and they would be like, oh my gosh, wow, that's so cool. And you're like, yeah, actually, that's not very impressive from an AI perspective, but to your novice user, it was very impressive. And so we called that AI theater. And so I tell my companies a lot of times, like sometimes for some types of buyers, you need this piece of AI theater, because as a product person, you're actually trying to make it invisible to the user. You're trying to make the product awesome. And then they complain that there's no AI. And you're like, the whole reason it works so well is because there's all kinds of AI. So think about whether or not you need AI theater, because some types of products and buyers do. And so I put this graphic in here to just sort of show you, this is actually from the new version of Backupify that the Acquire built, but it's got this little export process if you want to export your data, and the wheel spins so you know it's working, because it's actually going to take you like 6 hours. So anyway, okay, so now I want to talk about the Pac Framework. And this is something where I came up with this because I was asked to speak a couple years ago on where do you get started with AI? And where most companies get started, if they're big companies, is they have 1 or 2 executives who just think AI is cool and they try to adopt it there. And like that may or may not be the right place. That might not even be a piece of your business where AI is relevant or makes any sense or you have any data. And people aren't looking at it through a business type of lens. So what I decided to do was, think about how I might approach it. So we came up with this idea called the Pac Framework. Don't confuse it with, if you're technical in an AI, you know that there's an algorithm called PAC, probably approximately correct is what it stands for. That's not what we're talking about, okay? This PAC framework stands for what you see on the screen here, 3 things AI can do: predict, automate, and classify. There's a lot you can do with AI. If I was getting started, I would try to do one of these 3 things. So the way you use this is you think about the 3 areas of your business that you could consider using AI. Things related to your customers, things related to your product, things related to your business operations. And I would think about the 3 things AI can do: predict, automate, and classify. And I would make a grid like this. One, automate, predict, automate, and classify on one side, customers, product, and operations on the other side. And I would brainstorm things to put in the boxes, right? What can we automate about our operations? We can automate common monotonous workflows. What can we, classify about our product? We could classify customer input. When they send us some kind of feedback, we can automatically route it. Is this a product feature? Is this a help request and a bug report? Is it, what is it? Is this a training issue? What can we predict about our customers or our operations? Maybe we can predict which deals will close. Maybe we can predict employee attrition, et cetera. So you make this box, and maybe you don't fill in every box with something, and maybe you do. And then I think what you do is, I don't have another slide for that. And then I think what you do is you look at this and you say, well, number one, which of these can we do, right? Do we have the data to do this? Do we have the skills to do this? Some things that are natural language processing, for example, are still a little bit hard. You could say, what I'd love to automate for my product? I'd love to automate generation of the help guide from the user guide. Like, probably not going to happen. That's a little hard right now, right? But that might be an idea you come up with. So I think you're gonna look at these and figure out like what is feasible given the current state of AI, and what do you have the data to actually do, particularly if you're trying to do a prediction issue or a classification issue. And then I would also think about the impact that it would have on your business. So there are definitely things that you might say, well, we could do that, but it would be a lot of work and the value would be marginal. So maybe you want to focus on the things where you have the biggest ROI, right? Where however difficult it is to do, the payoff for doing it is many times greater. And then those are the things that I would bite off. And you can use this in your sales process, right? So customers love this when they're like, hey, you were looking at this and you say, oh, look, if you've ever read a book, there's a really good sales book as you start to scale. I would encourage you to read it, called The Challenger Sale. And Challenger Sale is a lot about being an expert, right? And being willing to sometimes push back on the customer and be like, that sounds great. I understand your needs, but I'm the expert. You should listen to me. And what you could say is, look, I'm the expert. Let me tell you how you should think about it. Here's this thing called the Pac Framework. And let's look at it for your business and see what we sell is in the, we're an RPA company. So what we sell is in the automate and operations bucket. So now that you've mapped that out, hey, yes, there is a need for our tool, here. So, so something you can think about. I've written a lot about this online. If you Google, Rob May Pac Framework, probably some talks and a couple of pieces will come up if you want to read more. And then finally, thinking about, business school, Michael Porter, traditional strategy as MBAs think about it. You want to make sure that you're putting AI in places that's going to give you an advantage. And there are a lot of places in a business where you're going to have to adopt it, and it's just going to be a race to the bottom. And all the companies are going to do it, and everybody's going to match you, and then the consumer benefits, not your company. So you have to do it, but you want to focus on the areas that you are unique. And so the way to think about that is to look at value chains. So if you haven't studied value chains formally, right, it's the series of steps that you do to make whatever it is that you make. And value chains are different. And in general, if you're in a good industry and you're competing strategically, your value chain looks different than somebody that does a similar thing. So take Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks, right? Dunkin' Donuts is just ubiquitous here in Boston where I am. And there's a lot of people that complain about Dunkin' Donuts coffee, right? But it's not as good as Starbucks. It's not the point, right? Starbucks is going to spend, their value chain is more time sourcing beans, more times working with farmers, because their value chain is, high quality coffee, fair trade sourced, all that kind of stuff. Dunkin' Donuts strategy is like, we're places that are easy to get in and out of and get cheap coffee and maybe something to eat, right? They're not catering to people that want to come sit and sip coffee for 3 hours while they work on their laptops. And so as a result, both companies can be successful. There's not a right or wrong, but they compete by doing different things, right? Dunkin' Donuts is focused on operations that drive down the price of their coffee. Dunkin' Donuts is focused on locations that are easy to get in and out of by car. Starbucks is more likely to be in the walkable neighborhoods where people are going to, or shopping centers where you're going to park and sit for a while. And so when you start thinking about this, you think, well, what new value chain activities might come from building an AI company? And there are new steps that you could put in here. Labeling data for a model. The way most of these machine learning models learn today is called supervised learning. You have to have labeled data. If you just have a bunch of images of animals and nobody's identified what they are, well, you can't go feed them to a machine yet, right? You have to label them and say, I don't want to say you can't, like one of you guys who's super technical is going to say, no, you could use unsupervised learning and clustering. Like, yes, you can. It's probably not going to work very well. Most of it's supervised learning. So supervised learning means you have to go through and have somebody say, that's a cat, that's a dog, that's a tiger, that's a, otter, that's an elephant. And then you can feed those to the machines. And then when new ones come in, once they've seen enough examples, it can tell, wow, that's an elephant, that's a snake, that's a bird. So, so labeling data might be a function in your value chain now. Well, how would that differ by company? Well, how do you get the data labeled, right? The way that Starbucks and Dunkin' Donuts might have different approaches to getting their beans, different approaches to how they choose where to put their stores. Labeling data, could vary as well. Are you gonna, if you're doing something that's very esoteric, where you need specific knowledge and you need very bright people to do it, maybe you need doctors to label health images of some kind. You might have to employ a few internally. They're more expensive. It's harder to scale them, and you can't hire. But at the same time, you're getting very specific knowledge about something. Whereas, if you use something like Mechanical Turk, where Amazon's just going to spray things out there and let whoever thinks they can label the data, label it, your average person is not going to be able to accurately label an X-ray for a broken bone or a radiology image or a mammogram. And so, but, if you're like, hey, here's a picture of a license plate, what is this letter? They can do that all day. You don't need to pay, doctors $200,000 a year to label that kind of data. So, and so the advantage there is Mechanical Turk is highly scalable, and, you can grow faster and everything else. But that means labeling data is probably not your competitive advantage in this stage of the business. Or you could have employees do it. If you're selling a tool to people and a tool gets smarter as you use it, maybe as part of their usage workflow in the UI and the UX, the employees that are using the tool actually label the data in certain ways. So you can think about labeled data as a specific step in the value chain, for example. And there are other things here. They have general learning workflows and feedback loops. How do you correct machine learning models, if they're not accurate? Because again, this is not software that's like yes or no. This is software that's giving a probabilistic output, right? 85% yes, 92% yes. What about those cases where it does misclassify something? There are dogs that look like cats. There are cats that look like dogs. They're rare. If the machine hasn't seen one, it's going to mislabel it. So you have to think about those things. And so some ideas for AI and value chains, don't put it at the end. You know what a lot of people do? They have their existing value chain here, and they're like, let's tack on an AI step at the end. Like, that's stupid. That's not going to work. You want to rethink your whole value chain, and you want to think about, going back to the Pac Framework, where can you actually build a strategic competitive advantage using AI in your business by how you do something? Maybe you make it more personalized because you introduce personalization algorithms with the data that you have, right? Maybe you drive the cost down. Maybe it's more automated and therefore it's faster. I looked at a company today that is generating, they can generate video literally on demand. They're generating custom videos with sort of like standard backgrounds, but you could take 2 minutes of video of me talking like this, and now you can make me say whatever you want for your commercial, and they can literally wait and generate that 30 seconds before you need to see it. Right, which is pretty interesting. I don't have to like spend 3 weeks and set up a shoot and get a video, hire me to come in and talk and then have the video sitting there and then post it on the website. Like, as that tech gets better and better, you can think about hyper-personalized video, right? So that's an interesting, value chain differentiator from an AI perspective. So don't put the AI at the end. Think about these new steps: label data, train and generate models, monitor and retrain, stuff like that. There's actually, if you're interested, there's a good book called Competing in the Age of AI that was written by a guy named Kareem Lakhani at Harvard Business School. And he's the guy that Harvard hired to come in and update Harvard's curriculum for an AI world. And so the book's pretty good. It's definitely worth reading. A little bit dry, but it's worth working your way through. And similar, if you think about Michael Porter's 5 forces. So if you don't know about this, this is the theory that your profits in an industry really come from how competitive the industry is across these 5 forces. And so if you look at this and you're thinking about going into a specific industry as an entrepreneur, or you're thinking about, some of you, when you have these early companies and you have product market fit, your business model could go in different directions, right? For example, you could sell through a channel, you could sell direct, you could do both, you could bundle with other things, right? And so when you think about that, you might want to think about how these things like labeled data, data network effects, sort of this flywheel of like recommendation algorithms, right? We're really good and therefore more people use it and therefore we get more data and that makes us even better. How do those impact how you think about these forces, the threat of new entrants, right? Can labeled data for your use case become a barrier to entry, for example? Or do most of your consumers or most of your competitors have similar labeled data sets, and can they get them? And are there substitutes? Can you substitute something for that labeled data? Is there a proxy, right? Things like that. So I would think about that as you scale and determine what your final business model looks like. And then finally, I'll end with some warnings and things to think about. One, the trade-offs to make AI successful can sometimes be dangerous and counter trend. And so a big one that you see sometimes is training and putting AI into your user interface versus making your user interface super easy. And there's been this trend of consumerization of IT, right? So we want all our IT tools to work like Dropbox and Gmail and everything that's super easy, which breaks from this like decade-long trend of like, you used to have, when I got my start as an engineer in the early 2000s, like any new software we had to install on servers, we would go to like a 2 or 3 day training course for it. And you'd have to learn to use it because it was never easy. And now they've done that and we've abstracted it away. And maybe that's the power of the AI in your tool, is that the interface is super simple and can figure out what you're doing from other data points. Or maybe you require the user to do some things they're not used to doing, like labeling data. And so now you're selling against a competitor's product that has no AI, but has a simpler user interface. So that's where these things can be kind of dangerous. Data control and quality issues can get really, really complicated as you start building, models that take data from multiple sources. One of those sources breaks, their terms of service changes, their data structure changes. It can ripple through your whole data pipeline and be a mess. Models can go out of calibration. Sometimes we see these startups where they get a data set and they train the model and they run the model and they do it. And in 6 months, they haven't retrained the model because they just think, well, they run their model against the thing and they're not really AI people and they're focused on other things. But sometimes those models don't work well as the use cases expand. And so, a perfect example would be if you're training your phone to unlock itself when it looks at your face. And maybe the first few people that use that, it works really well, but then you start getting people trying to unlock themselves in, dark lighting in bars late at night whenever COVID's over and we can do that again. Strobe lights in a disco, in the middle of, it's snowing here in Boston right now. You're out in a snowstorm with a hat on and ski goggles, right? Do you have to lift your ski goggles up so it recognizes you and things like this. So your models can start to not perform as you thought they performed when you had 100 customers. They might not perform as well when you have 5,000 customers. And then part of the reason for that also, your data can drift, your underlying data set. So a simple example of data drift might be if you had AI in the early 1900s and you trained it on, to predict the average height of a US citizen when they were, 4 years old, how tall do I think they're going to be when they grow up? That model wouldn't work anymore because people are slightly taller on average due to changes in healthcare, changes in nutrition, and stuff like that. So your underlying data set can drift. Maybe the better example of this is language. In 1982, if you said, I'm going to surf the web, people would say that doesn't even make any sense. What do you mean? And so words acquire new meaning and new usage over time. And so language as a data set is constantly drifting and changing. And most data sets actually are. It's one of the things I see that people overlook the most. So those are some things to think about. This is me. If you want to, reach out, follow me on Twitter for all my controversial opinions. Email me, rob@pjc.vc if you have questions or want to pitch me or want to send me a friend's company that looks cool.